The incident report filed by Administrator Elias Rourke on the morning of the 14th day of Ambassador Elias Rourke's posting described the event in the careful, neutral language of a professional who had witnessed something that exceeded his available categories and had decided the best approach was to document exactly what had happened without attempting to explain it. The report said that at Go 618 station time, a Varag juvenile designated Keth had made contact with the incoming ambassador's left forearm during an uncontrolled encounter in Docking Bay 9. The report said that the contact had resulted in tissue damage requiring medical treatment. The report said that the ambassador had declined all standard grievance procedures, security separation protocols, and hazard compensation provisions available under Consortium Diplomatic Incident Guidelines. The report did not say what Valen had seen on the dock in the minutes after the contact aired, because he did not have the language for it and did not believe the incident report format was designed to hold the kind of observation he wanted to make. He wrote it in his private file instead. He wrote, "The ambassador was injured." His first question was whether the cub was all right. He sat down on the floor and talked to it. Then he closed the private file and submitted the official report and went to deal with the 4 other things that required his attention before the morning briefing. To understand why this was significant, it helped to understand what a Varag juvenile was. Varags were one of the consortium's most significant allied species, which was the diplomatic language for a species that the consortium needed to maintain good relations with and had learned, through specific historical experience, not to underestimate. They were pursuit predators, large and fast and built by evolution for a world that had required them to be both. An adult Varag could run at speeds that most vehicles found competitive. Their jaw pressure was measured in units that structural engineers used for load-bearing calculations. Their sensory systems processed motion at rates that made standard security response protocols look approximate. A juvenile Varag was all of these things in a smaller and less controlled package. Keth had been on Conquered Spindle for 3 months before Rourke arrived. He was there because his mother, Matriarch Sarax, had decided that interspecies socialization was essential for any young Varag who would one day be expected to operate in diplomatic contexts. The Varag matriarchs had been making this argument to the Consortium Council for 2 generations, with the specific persistence of beings who understood that the argument was correct and were prepared to keep making it until the relevant institutions arrived at the same conclusion. The consortium had agreed, in principle 3 years ago. In practice, it meant that Conquered Spindle had a 93-kilogram juvenile pursuit predator in its residential section. An administrator, Elias Rourke, had been managing the consequences of this for 3 months with the specific patience of a professional who had calculated the political cost of complaining and found it higher than the cost of simply managing. The staff had developed habits. The maintenance crew took the long corridor when Keth was in the exercise area. The administrative aides had learned to check the handler's daily movement log before planning their routes. The Teshan delegation had submitted 2 formal requests to relocate their quarters to the opposite side of the station, both of which had been reviewed and referred to committee, where they would remain indefinitely. None of this was unreasonable. Keth was not dangerous in the way that an adult Varag in a combat posture was dangerous. He was dangerous in the way that a 93-kilogram animal with a still-developing inhibition system and a sensory apparatus calibrated for a very different environment was dangerous, which was the particular danger of something that was not trying to cause harm and occasionally did anyway. His handler, Jess, was competent and genuinely invested in the assignment. He maintained detailed behavioral logs, ran the recommended exercise protocols, and had developed a working relationship with Keth that involved mutual tolerance, occasional cooperation, and a consistent asymmetry in which Jess provided the structure, and Keth determined how closely to adhere to it. On the morning of the 14th day of Rourke's posting, the exercise gate had failed at the wrong moment. Keth had been through the gate before the secondary lock engaged, which meant he had been in the main corridor before Jess had a clean hold on the guide tether, which meant he had reached the docking bay at approximately the same moment as an incoming ambassador whose arrival scent was new and whose movement during Keth's assessment circuit had been exactly the kind of stimulus that an imperfectly developed inhibition system did not handle well. The bite had lasted less than 2 seconds. The consequence had lasted considerably longer. Rourke had been on the floor talking to the cub when the medical team arrived. Dr. Ilsa Vorn, who had been chief medical officer on Conquered Spindle for 9 years, and who had developed across those 9 years, a professional relationship with surprise that involved acknowledging it and moving past it as quickly as possible, had taken one look at the scene and made a rapid assessment. The assessment was that the injured party was sitting on the dock floor in an expensive diplomatic suit with blood on his left sleeve, apparently engaged in a conversation with the animal that had caused the injury, and that the injured party's primary physiological indicators, while elevated from baseline, did not suggest shock or imminent systemic failure. She had administered the venom counteragent with the efficiency of someone who had trained for this scenario. She had examined the wound with the focused attention that the wound required. She had delivered the recovery timeline with the clinical precision that her professional standards demanded. The ambassador had listened to all of it and then asked how the cub was. Vorn had looked at the cub, which was still in the wall-pressed posture of a juvenile in acute distress, scales pale and tail low, making the low-frequency contact sound that Vorn's cross-species medical training identified as a distress vocalization used by very young Varags. She had said, "The cub is physically unharmed." Rourke had said, "That is not what I meant." Vorn had looked at him for a moment. Then she had said, "The cub's stress indicators are significantly elevated." The behavior you are observing is consistent with acute distress in a juvenile Varag following a high-impact event. Rourke had said, "How do you address that?" Vorn had said, "In the standard protocol, the juvenile is returned to its quarters under handler supervision, and the stress response is allowed to resolve over time in a controlled environment." Rourke had said, "Does that work?" Vorn had for the first time in her 9 years on Conquered Spindle, not known how to answer a question from a patient. She had said, "It is the established procedure." Rourke had said, "That is not what I asked." What Rourke did instead of the established procedure was sit on the dock floor in his expensive diplomatic suit for 14 minutes and talk to the cub in the even unhurried voice that Valen would later come to recognize as the tone Rourke used when he had decided something mattered and was willing to let it take the time it took. The content of what he said was simple. He used Keth's name. He said that what had happened and was over. He said that the moment after a bad decision was where the actual character question was, not the moment of the decision itself, and that the moment after mattered more than the moment before. He said that he was not going to pretend the arm did not hurt because it did, but that pain had a timeline, and what mattered now was what came next. He said that he was going to need Keth to look at him. Keth looked at him. He said that he was going to need Keth to breathe. Keth breathed. He said that nothing about what happened in the next few days was going to be more important than what Keth chose to do in the hours immediately following this moment. He did not say any of this loudly. He did not say it with the theatrical emphasis of someone performing a speech. He said it the way a person says things to a young creature in distress, in the register of someone who has done this before, not necessarily with this species, but with the general category of frightened young things that had made a bad decision and needed to hear someone speak to them, as though the bad decision was not the whole of what they were. Valen watched this from his position near the dock entrance and thought about everything he had read in the briefing file about Ambassador Rourke's background. The file had mentioned the commendation for crisis management. It had not been specific about the nature of the crisis. He thought he was beginning to understand what kind of crises Rourke specialized in. In the 3 weeks between the dock incident and the formal review, Keth changed, not dramatically, not in the ways that got written up in behavioral assessment reports with clinical language and numerical scores. In the ways that Jess noticed first and documented carefully, and that Valen read each morning with the specific attention of someone trying to understand a process they had not seen before. The cub had started asking. This was not a behavior that appeared in the Varag juvenile developmental literature as a normal stage. Varag juveniles approached what they wanted to approach, within the limits of whatever physical or social barriers existed, and the work of handlers was to maintain those limits with sufficient consistency that the juvenile's behavior remained within acceptable parameters. The literature did not discuss a juvenile who had internalized the concept of asking permission, because the concept of a Varag juvenile asking permission before approaching had not been a documented phenomenon. Keth was asking not always, not in every context, but with a regularity that Jess found significant enough to flag in his daily logs. The cub was pausing at the threshold of new environments or new interactions and producing the Varag vocalization that translated approximately as I would like to enter.
May I?
The translation was approximate because the Varag language did not have a direct equivalent for the social structure embedded in that phrase. The concept of seeking permission implied a recognition of another being's right to grant or withhold it, which was a more complex social framework than juvenile Varag typically operated within. Keth was operating within it. Jess had written in his log, at the end of the 2nd week, "I do not know what the ambassador said to him on the dock." I do not have the recording because the ambient recording system in Bay 9 was on its maintenance cycle. But whatever it was, it produced a behavioral shift that I have not seen in any of the documentation on Varag juvenile development. He is not complying with external restrictions. He is applying internal ones. Valen had read this log entry 3 times and then sent Jess a formal commendation for thorough documentation, which was the appropriate administrative response, and then sat at his desk for 20 minutes thinking about the distinction Jess had identified. External restrictions were the structure that handlers maintained. Internal ones were the structure of being applied to itself. The difference between those two things was the difference between a contained predator and a trustworthy one. The formal review convened with more attendance than the event strictly required because news on Conquered Spindle traveled through channels that no administrative protocol had been written to manage, and by the time the session began there were 31 witnesses present who had not been on the original notification list. Rourke sat in the center position. His arm was properly treated and in a support brace. His expression had the alert ease of someone who had been in formal proceedings many times and had learned that the way to manage them was to pay close attention and not borrow trouble. Keth sat beside him on the floor. This had not been arranged. Keth had been in the outer corridor when Rourke arrived for the session, in the waiting posture that had become characteristic of the cub's mornings, and when Rourke had gone into the chamber Keth had followed him, and nobody in the room had quite found the moment to say that this was procedurally irregular before the moment had passed, and the cub was simply there, claws tucked and tail wrapped in scales at a careful neutral tone. Counselor Menvar, the senior council representative, opened by confirming the known facts of the incident and the ambassador's decision to decline standard grievance procedures. He asked Rourke to explain his reasoning. Rourke said, because the cub understood what he had done approximately half a second after he did it, and because the relevant question is not what happened in the moment, but what happened in all the moments after it, Menvar said, the injury itself was significant. Rourke said, the injury was real. I am not contesting it. I am contesting the interpretation of it as the complete picture of what occurred. Menvar turned to the medical report, which Vaughan delivered with precise clinical language and a specific emphasis on the phrase controlled grip that she had placed in the report during the drafting and that she delivered with the care of someone who understood it was important and wanted to make sure it landed. She said that the bite pattern was consistent with Varag juvenile play contact grip rather than predatory attack posture, that the venom injection was present but limited, and that the ambassador's recovery was proceeding on the expected timeline. She said in the final sentence of her report, that she had treated injuries across many species in 9 years, and that she had not previously been in a situation where the injured party's primary concern, immediately following injury, had been the psychological state of the animal that had caused it. She said she had included this observation because it was relevant to understanding the full context of the incident. Menvar looked at her, She looked back with the expression of someone who had said exactly what they intended to say and was not open to further discussion about it. Menvar turned to Keth. He said, the juvenile may speak. Keth straightened, He had been practicing this moment, though he had not told anyone he was practicing it. He had been practicing it in the exercise space and in the corridor and in the quiet of his quarters, the specific words in the specific register, because he understood that this moment was one of the ones that went into the record, and he wanted the record to contain what he actually meant rather than what came out when he was not prepared. He said, I was startled and my body made a decision before I directed it to. I understood what I had done in the moment after I did it. In the 3 weeks since, I have practiced the things that the ambassador said to me on the dock. I have asked before approaching. When the instinct to move quickly comes, I speak first. When a loud sound happens near me, I count to 3 before I respond. He paused. He said, I did not do these things because I was required to. I did them because I caused harm, and harm requires repair, and the repair that I am capable of is to demonstrate in the days after the moment that the moment was not the whole of what I am. He said, I do not ask that this incident be forgotten, I ask that the record show both the incident and what I did in the weeks following it, so that anyone who reviews the record has the complete account rather than only the first part. The room was quiet, Rourke said nothing. He had said what he needed to say before the session, and he understood that this moment belonged to Keth. Then the small Bellari child was brought into the chamber. Her family had requested the opportunity to make a statement. What no one had anticipated was that she would not go to the speaking platform. She walked directly to Keth with the straight-line directness of a very young being for whom the indirect route is not yet instinctive, and she stopped in front of him and said, You pushed me when the heavy thing fell. You ran very fast and pushed me so the heavy thing would not hit me. Keth was very still. You were scared that you had hurt me, the child said. But you did not hurt me. She reached out and placed her small hand against the side of his jaw. You were fast, and you were careful, and you are good, The scales across Keth's shoulders and neck shifted through a slow pattern that Valen's species recognition system could not find a precise category for, It was not any of the threat patterns or distress patterns, or the careful neutral tone the cub had been maintaining. It was something else, something that belonged to a creature updating a significant assumption about itself. The review concluded without formal censure. The movement and protocols were maintained for an additional assessment period. Several policy revision processes were initiated. New language was drafted for Keth's behavioral file that the existing templates had not been designed to contain. After the chamber emptied, Valen found Rourke in the outer gallery, which had become Rourke's preferred location in the evenings when the day allowed it. Keth was beside him. The gas giant that Conquered Spindle orbited was doing what it always did, turning in its enormous slow circle in the light of the system's star. Valen said, "The review went well." Rourke said, "It went honestly." "That is better than well." Valen stood at the rail and thought about the distinction. He said, "You are going to file guardianship papers." It was not a question. He had been reading the pattern for 3 weeks. Rourke looked at him. Then he said, "If his mother agrees and the council does not find a procedural objection." Valen said, "You were bitten by him less than a month ago." Rourke said, "Yes." He looked at Keth, who was watching the gas giant with the settled attention of a creature that was exactly where it expected to be. "And now he is family-shaped." Valen had encountered this phrase in human documentation before. It was the kind of phrase that appeared in personal communications and informal reports, and was almost never used in formal diplomatic language, because formal diplomatic language did not have a good way to hold the specific quality of meaning it contained. He thought about what family-shaped meant from the perspective of a species that had been applying the concept across species lines for 15,000 years. He thought about what it meant that Rourke had arrived on Conquered Spindle, been bitten within the hour, and had spent the following weeks not managing the political consequences of a diplomatic incident, but building something with the animal that had caused it. He said, "The consortium does not have a framework for this." Rourke said, "I know." He paused. "Most things worth doing do not fit the existing framework when they start." The guardianship application was submitted 6 weeks into the posting and processed through channels that had not previously been used for an application of this type, because an application of this type had not previously been submitted. The legal office spent 3 days determining which review process applied before concluding that the closest existing framework was the provision for extended diplomatic dependent status, which had been designed for a different set of circumstances, but contained the relevant legal structures. The application was forwarded to the Varag Cultural Liaison for mandatory cultural review. It was forwarded to the Consortium Medical Board for a species compatibility assessment. It was forwarded to 3 other offices, whose involvement was either required by regulation or recommended by the legal office as a precaution against later challenges. The cultural review from the Varag liaison arrived first and was 2 pages long. The first page was standard assessment material. The second page contained a personal note from the liaison officer that said, in the careful formal language of a professional who had clearly spent time choosing words, "I have reviewed the application and the supporting documentation." I want to note for the record that the pattern of interaction described in the documentation is not consistent with what this office would typically expect from a non-Varag seeking guardianship of a Varag juvenile. What I observe in the documentation is a pattern consistent with what the Varag call Kethavar, which is a term that does not translate cleanly into galactic standard, but which refers to the relationship formed between a young Varag and a non-family adult who demonstrates, through sustained action rather than stated intent, a commitment to the cub's development and safety. The consortium has no administrative category for this relationship. I recommend creating one. The consortium's administrative office noted the recommendation and referred it to committee. The response from Matriarch Sarax arrived on the 40th day after the application was filed. It was 3 sentences. The first sentence said that she had reviewed the application and the documentation submitted with it. The second sentence said that a human had been willing to sit on a dock floor with an injured arm and speak to her son about what it meant to make a mistake and what it meant to repair one, and that her son had understood the difference, and that understanding the difference was one of the most important things a young Varag could learn, and one of the most difficult things to teach. The third sentence said, My son has my permission and my blessing. The morning the application was approved, Valen arrived at the administrative office to find Keth already there. The cub was in the outer corridor, in the waiting posture, which was normal. What was not normal was that he was not waiting for Rourke's door to open. He was waiting for Valen. Valen stopped. Keth looked at him. Then the cub produced, from somewhere in the carrier pack he had been permitted to use on approved errands, a folded piece of station correspondence paper, and held it out with the careful deliberateness of a creature that had practiced this movement. Valen took it. It was a note, handwritten in the careful block letters of someone who was still learning to write in galactic standard and was paying close attention to the shapes of each character. It said, Administrator Valen Rourke, You did not send me away when I was at my worst. You kept the record correctly. I wanted you to know that I know this, It was signed with Keth's name in the angular script that young Varags used before their handwriting developed the flowing curves of adult Varag formal script. Valen looked at the note for a long moment, Then he folded it carefully and put it in his inner pocket, which was not where official documentation went, and he said, The application was approved this morning, Keth's scales shifted through the slow warm pattern that Valen had come to associate with the specific quality of Keth's good news, different from the bright flash of immediate excitement, the deep steady color of something that had been hoped for and had arrived. The cub said, I know. Elias told me last night. Valen said, Then why are you waiting here? Keth said, Because I wanted to thank you, You kept the record correctly. That mattered. Valen said after a moment, You are welcome. Keth said, I have one more question. Valen said, Ask. Keth said, Will you write to me after we leave? Valen thought about this, Then he said, I will write to you. The cub said, Good, and I will write to you. I am still learning, but Elias says I am getting better. He turned and went back down the corridor toward Rourke's quarters, his tail moving in the easy rhythm of an animal that had somewhere specific to be, and was not in a hurry to get there, because the somewhere specific was not going anywhere. Valen stood in the corridor with the folded note in his pocket and thought about records, and about what it meant to keep them correctly. He thought about the incident report he had filed 6 weeks ago in the careful neutral language of a professional documenting something that exceeded his available categories. He thought about the private file where he had written what the official report could not contain. He thought about what the record would show when it was read by whoever read it next. It would show a Varag juvenile who had bitten a human ambassador in the first hour of his posting and had spent the following 6 weeks demonstrating, through daily choices rather than stated intent, who he intended to be. It would show a human ambassador who had sat on a dock floor with an injured arm and asked if the cub was all right, and who had spent the following 6 weeks building something that the consortium's administrative framework had no category for, and had filed the paperwork to make it official anyway. It would show a young Varag who had learned the difference between a mistake and a failure, and the difference between what you did in the worst moment and what you chose to do in all the moments after it. Valen went to his office. He opened a new document. He wrote, I am beginning a personal correspondence with a young Varag diplomat in training who is departing this station with his guardian. This is not an official administrative record. It is a personal one. I am noting its existence here because the events that led to it are part of the official record, and the personal record does not exist separately from them. He saved the document. He went to work. Outside the window, the gas giant turned in its orbit, patient and enormous and entirely unchanged by anything that had happened on the small ring of the station that circled it. Everything on the station was different anyway. The departure came on a Tuesday morning, which was not the dramatic scheduling that the occasion seemed to deserve, but which Rourke had specifically requested, because he said that important things did not need to announce themselves, and that departures, which felt like ceremonies, tended to produce a quality of finality that was not accurate when the departure was not an ending. The dock was full anyway. The maintenance crew was there. The administrative aides were there. Dr. Vaughan was there with her medical scanner and her professional neutrality, and the expression she wore when she was managing a strong feeling with the tool of her professionalism. Handler Jess was there with the expression of someone who had expected this posting to be a difficult 3 months and had been surprised in ways he was still processing. Even the Tessian delegation, who had filed 2 formal requests to relocate their quarters away from the Varag juvenile, were there. They stood at the back of the dock near the entrance and did not say anything, which was its own kind of statement. Keth wore a fitted travel harness in the dark blue that Valen had selected from the options the fabrication office had provided, with the small Earth flag patch that Rourke had asked to be added when he saw the options. He stood beside Rourke with the specific quality of stillness that was not the frightened contraction of the dock 6 weeks ago, but the deliberate, chosen stillness of a creature that had learned the difference. Rourke said his formal farewell to Valen with the efficiency of someone who understood that formal farewells were not the point, and that the point had already been made across 6 weeks of daily choices. Then he said, I will send updates. Valen said I expect them. Keth looked at Valen and produced a note he had been holding in one careful forepaw. He said, I wrote a second one. For the departure, Valen took it. The note said, I will remember that I bit you and you kept the record correctly, and that both of those things are part of the same story. Halfway up the boarding ramp, Keth stopped and turned back to the dock. He said, in a clear voice that carried across the full space, I did bite the ambassador. He paused. He taught me better things to do with my mouth. The dock produced a sound that crossed species lines. Valen added it to the private file. Then the ramp closed, and the ship undocked, and the gas giant kept turning, and the station kept its orbit, and the record of what had happened on Conquered Spindle in 6 weeks was complete. It was not the record anyone would have predicted on the morning of the 14th day of Rourke's posting. It was the record that had been built, one choice at a time, by a human who had sat on a dock floor and asked if the cub was all right. Valen kept the 2 notes in his inner pocket for a long time. They were not official documentation. They were the thing that the official documentation had been trying, in its careful neutral language, to point toward. He kept them there and went back to work and waited for the first letter. It arrived 11 days later, written in the careful block letters that were getting better, signed with the angular script that had not yet developed its curves. It said, We arrived. Elias says hello. I met a goose. It was aggressive. I used words first. The goose did not care. Elias says this is normal. Valen read the letter twice and filed it in the personal record and wrote back. He kept writing back. That was the part that the incident report had not been able to contain, the part that had not fit in any of the official frameworks, the part that was simply what happened when a human decided that family-shaped was a category worth creating administrative paperwork for. The record grew one letter at a time, one correctly kept account at a time. The kind of record that lasted. The first week after the departure produced a specific quality of quiet on Conquered Spindle that Valen had not anticipated. He had expected things to return to normal. Normal was what stations did when significant events concluded. The administrative machinery resumed its standard rhythms, aired. The routine disputes and maintenance calls and diplomatic correspondence that constituted the actual substance of his working days aired. And the extraordinary thing that had occupied the foreground of his attention for 6 weeks receded into the background where past events lived. What he had not expected was to notice the absence aired. He noticed it in the mornings first. He had developed, without being aware of it, a habit of checking the outer corridor when he arrived at the office, aired. Because for 3 weeks, there had been a 93-kilogram Varag juvenile waiting there with the patient certainty of a creature that had decided this corridor was where things happened and that it intended to be present for them, aired. The corridor was empty now, and the emptiness had a specific quality that the corridor had not had before Keth arrived. He noticed it in the afternoons, aired, when the administrative wing had its quiet period, and he sometimes looked toward the door, expecting to hear the particular sound of claws on the corridor floor, aired, the rhythmic soft click that he had learned to identify as Keth moving at a careful pace rather than the rapid scrape of the animal in full motion. He noticed it in the evenings, aired, when he passed the outer gallery and saw that the rail was unoccupied. He wrote this in his private file because it seemed like the kind of observation that deserved to be written down, aired. Not because it was operationally significant, but because it was true, and the private file was where he put things that were true and did not have official categories. He wrote, aired, "The station is quieter since the departure. I did not expect to find this notable. I find it notable." Jess submitted his final handler report the day after the departure. It was thorough and specific and contained, aired. In the final section, a paragraph that Valen read 3 times before filing it, the paragraph said, "In my experience with Varag juvenile integration assignments," aired, "the behavioral outcomes I have documented in this report are without precedent. I want to be precise about what I mean by this. I have worked on 3 previous Varag juvenile integration postings. In each case, aired, the behavioral outcomes were consistent with the existing literature on Varag juvenile development, aired, which describes a process in which the juvenile's instinctive responses are managed through external constraint until the animal's natural maturation processes produce sufficient inhibition for safe, independent operation, aired. What I observed in this posting was not that process, aired. What I observed was a juvenile who encountered a specific kind of interaction early in the posting and used that interaction as the basis for an internally directed behavioral development that proceeded faster and in different directions than any maturation timeline the literature describes, aired. I do not have an explanation for this that fits within the existing framework, aired. I am recommending that the Consortium commission a formal review of the Varag juvenile developmental literature in light of the documented evidence from this posting, aired. Valen approved the recommendation and forwarded it with his own endorsement. He thought Jess was right about the literature. He also thought the literature was the smaller part of what deserved a review, aired. The Consortium Council session that convened 8 weeks after the departure addressed, among other items, the guardianship application outcome and its implications for consortium administrative law, aired. There were 17 items on the agenda. The guardianship item was 11th. By the time the session reached item 11, aired, it had spent 40 minutes on a shipping dispute and 30 minutes on a boundary reclassification, and 20 minutes on a medical resource allocation question, aired, which was the normal pace of a consortium session, working through a full agenda. Intbin 11 took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The debate was not about whether the guardianship had been correctly approved, aired. The legal review had established that the relevant provisions had been applied correctly and that the application had met all applicable requirements. The debate was about what the application meant for the framework, aired. The conservative faction argued that the framework should not be revised on the basis of a single case, and that the appropriate response was to treat the guardianship as a permitted exception under existing provisions rather than as the basis for new policy. The Reform faction argued that the appropriate response to a case that exposed a gap in the existing framework was to close the gap, and that treating the case as an exception rather than as evidence of an omission was the specific kind of institutional response that produced accumulating exceptions until the exceptions were effectively the policy anyway. Valen had been invited to speak as the posting administrator. He had prepared remarks. When the time came, he set the prepared remarks aside. He said, "I want to describe what I observed across 6 weeks on this station, not the administrative outcomes but the actual events, and I want the council to determine whether what I describe fits within the existing framework or whether it points towards something the framework needs to develop capacity to hold." He described the doc, not the incident report version, which was already in the council's files, but the version he had written in his private file, the one that contained what the neutral language of an official report had not been designed to carry. He described Rourke sitting on the floor with an injured arm and asking if the cub was all right. He described the 14 minutes of conversation. He described the 3 weeks of daily choices, the corridor mornings, the food vendor trials, the asking before approaching, the counting before responding, the promenade incident, and the controlled precision with which Keth had moved to put himself between the Bellari child and the falling cargo. He described the review session and Keth's statement and the child's small hand against the cub's jaw. He described the guardianship application and Sarak's 3 sentences. He described the note that was currently in his inner pocket, written in careful block letters that were getting better, signed with the angular script that had not yet developed its curves. He said, "I am not able to tell the council whether this fits within the existing framework. I'm able to tell the council that I watched something happen on this station that I had not previously believed was possible, and that the administrative record of it is incomplete because the administrative categories available to me were not designed to hold what I was seeing. If the council decides the framework is adequate, I will continue to work within it. If the council decides the framework needs to develop capacity for what I described, I will contribute everything I documented to that process." He sat down. The session went into recess. When it reconvened, the council chair announced that a formal review process would be opened on 3 specific questions. The first was whether the existing provisions for diplomatic dependent status were adequate to address the range of interspecies relationships that might arise in diplomatic contexts. The second was whether the Varag juvenile developmental literature required formal consortium review in light of the documented evidence from the Conquered Spindle posting. The third was whether the consortium's administrative framework for behavioral incident response needed to be revised to distinguish between incidents and the trajectory of the party responsible for them, which was a question that Jess's handler report had raised, and that Valen had been waiting for the council to notice 3 review processes. Valen filed the authorization documents and added them to the main case file and went back to the office and wrote to Keth. He told Keth about the session. Not the formal details, which were not the point, but the fact of it, the fact that 3 review processes had been opened because of what had happened on Conquered Spindle and what had been documented carefully enough to bring to a council session. He said in the letter, "The record you asked me to keep correctly is being used. I wanted you to know." The reply came 8 days later. It said, "I am glad." Elias says this is what happens when people do things right. The record goes places you cannot follow yourself and does work you did not know it was going to do. He says this is why the record matters. He says hello. Also, I am learning about a type of animal called a cat. It is very independent. Elias says this is normal. I do not think he fully believes it either. Valen read the letter twice and smiled in the specific way that he rarely allowed himself in professional contexts, and that the empty outer corridor could not observe. He wrote back, he said, "Tell the ambassador he is correct about the record. Tell him also that the 3 review processes will take approximately 18 months each, and that I intend to submit the full documentation from this posting to each of them, which means the record will be doing its work for the next 4 years at minimum." He said, "The cat situation sounds complicated. I recommend patience." He filed the correspondence in the personal record and opened the main case file and began pulling together the documentation for the first review submission. The case file was large. 6 weeks of daily logs, medical reports, handler assessments, incident documentation, behavioral records, council session records, correspondence from the Varag cultural liaison, the response from matriarch Serax, and the official and personal notes that together constituted the complete account of what had happened on Conquered Spindle in 6 weeks. He organized it carefully, the way he organized all documentation that needed to be read by people who had not been present for the events it described and needed the record to carry the weight of what those events had meant. He submitted it to the first review process. Then he went to the outer gallery and stood at the rail and looked at the gas giant turning in its orbit. 6 weeks ago, a human ambassador had arrived and been bitten within the hour and had sat on a dock floor and asked if the cub was all right. That was the beginning of it. Everything after that had been built on that beginning, one careful choice at a time, by 2 beings who had met in the worst possible circumstances and had decided apparently simultaneously and without consulting each other, that the worst possible circumstances were not the whole story, and that the whole story was worth building. The gas giant turned, the station orbited, the record went places you could not follow yourself, and did work you did not know it was going to do. Valen went back to his office and kept working. In the inner pocket of his formal jacket, the 2 notes waited. They were not going anywhere, neither was he. There was a great deal of work left to do, and the record needed to be kept correctly, and he had made a promise to a young Varag in careful block letters that he intended to keep 1 letter at a time. One correctly maintained account at a time, the kind of work that lasted. The second letter arrived with a photograph attached. Human photography had been a subject of minor administrative interest to Valen for years, the way many human practices were minor administrative interests, because photographs appeared in official documentation and required a specific kind of processing that standard document systems did not always handle cleanly. He had processed photographs as attachments to diplomatic communications, as exhibits in incident reports, as supporting documentation in applications and reviews. He had not previously received a photograph as personal correspondence. This one showed Rourke and Keth standing at the edge of what the brief note accompanying it described as a dock on a human agricultural world, where they were spending 3 weeks before the next posting rotation. The water behind them was wide and gray-green, and the sky above it was the specific pale blue that appeared in photographs from human worlds at certain times of year. Keth was approximately 20% larger than he had been when he left Conquered Spindle, which Valen noted because Varag juveniles grew fast in their second year, and the documentation had predicted this, but seeing it in a photograph was different from reading a projection. Rourke had one hand on the cub's neck ridge, in the easy way that Valen had seen in the gallery evenings, the way of someone who had done this many times and found it entirely natural. They were both looking at the camera. The note said, "Elias says you should see where we are. Keth says hello, and also the geese are still aggressive, but he has improved his technique." I have learned that the technique is to stand very still and look large, and they usually leave. Elias says this is also useful in diplomatic contexts. I think he is making a joke, but I am not certain. Valen looked at the photograph for a long time, then he printed it, which he had also not previously done with personal correspondence, and put it on his desk next to the main case file. He wrote back, I received the photograph. You are larger than when you left. The geese technique sounds operationally sound. Please tell the ambassador that the first review submission has been accepted and that the formal process is proceeding. Tell him also that Jess's handler report has been cited in the preliminary documentation as foundational material, which I believe he will find satisfying. He sent the letter and went back to the review documentation. The photograph stayed on the desk. It was still there when the review process concluded 18 months later and produced recommendations that the council adopted in modified form, and that changed 3 specific provisions of the consortium's administrative framework. It was still there when the second review concluded, and the Varag developmental literature was formally expanded to include the Conquered Spindle case documentation as a foundational reference. It was still there when the third review concluded and the behavioral incident response framework was revised to include the trajectory assessment provision that Jess had recommended in his final handler report. Valen had been part of all 3 processes. He had submitted documentation, attended sessions, answered questions from review committees who needed someone who had been present for the original events to explain what the documents described. He had been, across those 18 months, the person who carried the complete account from the thing that had happened to the institutional change that the thing had made possible. The photograph was on his desk for all of it. Not as evidence, not as documentation, as the thing that the documentation was pointing toward and that the documentation, no matter how thorough, could not fully contain. 2 beings at the edge of gray-green water on a human agricultural world, looking at a camera, both of them exactly where they were supposed to be. The record kept growing, 1 letter at a time. 1 correctly maintained account at a time, the kind of thing that lasted because it was true, and because someone had been paying attention from the beginning and had kept what they saw with the care it deserved. Valen kept paying attention. He kept writing back. That was enough. That was in fact more than enough. It was the whole of what the job required, and the whole of what the record needed, and the whole of what had made the difference. At 0618 on the 14th morning of a posting that had exceeded every available category. A human had sat on a dock floor and asked if the cub was all right. The rest had followed from that. The record showed it clearly. Valen made sure of it.